The ocean never forgets. It only waits. On the southern edge of Long Island, where the wind whispers secrets it was never meant to keep, the story of the Long Island serial killer begins. Not with a scream, not with a crime, but with a silence so deep it felt intentional. As if someone somewhere had pressed a finger to the lips of the world and said, "Watch, but do not speak." Before the name LISK became a shadow across headlines, before investigators stood frozen along Ocean Parkway, staring at the tall grass as if it could answer them, there was only a child. A boy growing up in ordinary rooms with ordinary walls, whose early years revealed nothing dramatic enough to warn anyone of what the future held. His childhood wasn't marked by chaos or obvious darkness, but by something far more unsettling. A steady absence of emotional noise. A calm that looked normal from the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. It was as if the boy learned very early that being unseen was safer than being known. Those who later tried to trace the origin of the killer struggled not because there were too many clues, but because there were so few. His upbringing appeared stable, structured, and unremarkable, rooted in suburban routines where mornings smelled of coffee and evenings dissolved into television light. The adults around him spoke of responsibility and discipline, not realizing how carefully he listened. He wasn't absorbing their words, but their behaviors, learning how masks worked, how politeness could become camouflage, and how silence could be power. In school, he was the kind of student teachers remembered vaguely. He blended into the background with surgical precision, completing assignments, following rules, and maintaining just enough eye contact to appear engaged, but never enough to invite questions. Classmates later described him with words like normal, quiet, or forgettable, phrases that in hindsight sound less like descriptions and more like warnings. He learned to disappear in plain sight. While other children sought attention, he observed, studied patterns, and built an internal map of human behavior that would later allow him to navigate adult life with unsettling ease. This habit followed him into higher education and then into his career. He chose fields that rewarded logic, organization, and emotional restraint. He constructed a professional life that allowed autonomy without scrutiny and access without exposure. Those who worked alongside him saw a competent colleague who met expectations and respected hierarchies. He understood that credibility is built not by excellence, but by consistency. And consistency became his shield, allowing him to move through the world with the comfort of someone who knew the rules but never felt bound by them. While others sought connection, he sought control. And for him, control meant managing every interaction so precisely that nothing could ever spiral beyond his grasp. It was during this time his understanding of human vulnerability deepened, not through violence, but through observation. He learned how anonymity could be weaponized, how technology created distance, and how fear could be planted not with force, but with words. This psychological awareness would become a defining element of the Long Island serial killer. Legend a legend, built less on what was seen and more on what was felt. Those who crossed his path described an unease they could never quite explain, a sense of being studied, evaluated, and reduced to variables in someone else's silent equation. The crimes, when they eventually surfaced, emerged slowly, like puzzle pieces scattered deliberately across time and geography. When authorities began connecting the dots, they weren't chasing a person, but a pattern. A methodical rhythm that suggested planning, patience, and an intimate familiarity with both human behavior and the landscape of Long Island. It was here among the marshes and the relentless wind that the full weight of the story began to surface, forcing investigators to confront the terrifying possibility. The killer was not an outsider, but someone deeply embedded within the community. Someone who drove the same roads, shopped in the same stores, and watched the same news reports describing a hunt that was unknowingly centered on him. As law enforcement intensified their efforts, the public oscillated between panic and disbelief. The idea that such calculated darkness could exist behind suburban doors was far more frightening than a visibly dangerous stranger. The killer thrived on this disbelief. It fed the illusion of safety that allowed him to continue living a double life. Behind the scenes, investigators wrestled with the unsettling realization that the person they were hunting might be watching them, too, studying their press conferences and analyzing their procedures. This was not a story driven by impulse, but by intention. Yet, despite this apparent control, cracks began to form. Subtle at first, emerging not from dramatic errors, but from the natural erosion that occurs when a carefully maintained facade is sustained for too long. No mask, no matter how expertly crafted, can remain flawless forever. By the end of this first chapter, the killer remains unnamed, a presence felt more than seen. The true horror of this story lies not in what happened along the shoreline, but in the realization that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it grows quietly, patiently, nurtured by routine and protected by normalcy. As the wind sweeps across Ocean Parkway, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The most dangerous secrets are not buried in the ground, but hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when silence finally breaks. The moment investigators realized they weren't dealing with isolated incidents, everything changed. The case shifted from a routine inquiry to something far more disturbing. Patterns, once you see them, can't be unseen. Suddenly, the Long Island shoreline wasn't just a road. It became a silent ledger, recording the choices of someone who understood time, geography, and human attention with chilling clarity. This realization didn't hit like a lightning bolt. It crept in during late-night meetings and quiet file reviews, as details that meant little on their own began to form a narrative too consistent to ignore. At the center of it all was the unsettling truth that the person responsible was enacting on impulse, but with cold, calculated patience. This wasn't chaos, it was a design. And that calculation is what truly frightened those tasked with stopping him. As task forces grew and jurisdictions overlapped, the investigation became a maze. Each department held fragments of a puzzle that only made sense when put together. But cooperation often struggled behind closed doors, slowed by bureaucracy and ego. The Long Island serial killer benefited from the very systems designed to catch him. Complexity creates delay, and delay creates opportunity. While authorities debated strategy, he continued to live a remarkably stable life, maintaining a job, routines, and social expectations. Those who met him during this period later recalled nothing unusual, which, in hindsight, became the most unusual detail of all. Media coverage exploded, bringing public pressure and fear. But the killer seemed to understand something fundamental about attention. It can be both revealing and blinding. He allowed the spotlight to scatter across different theories and suspects, while he remained comfortably in the shadows. He watched as amateur profilers argued online and TV commentators made dramatic assumptions. The public built an image of a monster that looked nothing like him. The real danger was just how ordinary he appeared, how convincingly he played the role of someone who belonged. This disconnect between what people expected and the reality of who he was allowed him to continue operating, psychologically unchallenged. But investigators were slowly learning to think like him, not to admire, but to anticipate. They started analyzing not just asterisk where asterisk things happened, but asterisk why asterisk those locations mattered, why the timing followed certain rhythms, why any communication was so controlled and detached. It all pointed to someone who got satisfaction, not from chaos, but from mastery, from the knowledge that he could shatter someone's sense of safety without ever being physically present. This insight shifted the focus to behavioral analysis. They weren't looking for a drifter anymore. The new profile was of someone embedded in the community, educated, and socially functional. Someone with an unnerving ability to compartmentalize his life, so that one identity never contaminated the other. This led to an uncomfortable truth. The killer likely understood them just as well as they were beginning to understand him. The case became a quiet standoff. Every public statement was evaluated by the very person it described. Every investigative move risked signaling too much. So, silence became a strategy. Fewer press conferences, tighter information control, and a focus on forensic consistency over dramatic breakthroughs. The goal was no longer just to solve the case, but to outweigh someone who thrived on patience. All the while, the killer's life showed no cracks, no sudden changes, no obvious excesses. He understood that deviation attracts attention, and attention threatens control. He adapted, refined his routines, and reinforced the walls between his public and private selves. This suggested he was learning, evolving traits you'd expect from a professional, not a predator. As years passed, the urgent manhunt turned into a long-term pursuit defined by endurance. This tested everyone. Time dulls urgency and erodes memory. But for those closest to the investigation, giving up was never an option. An unresolved story demands a conclusion, and the killer, though silent, continued to exert pressure simply by remaining a ghost. It was during this long silence that the most important changes happened. New leadership, fresh perspectives, and technological advancements began to reopen doors that were thought to be sealed forever. Suddenly, the case wasn't frozen in the past anymore. It was inching toward a future where answers felt possible again. The tension was no longer about whether the killer existed, but how close the truth might be. The patterns, once invisible, were now undeniable. Patience was being met with patience. The balance of control was slowly shifting. Though the Long Island serial killer remained unnamed at this stage, the illusion of his total invisibility was beginning to fracture. And as the investigation prepared to move into its most decisive phase, one unsettling question hung in the air. Not asterisk if asterisk, he will be found, but whether the world is ready to accept that the face behind the mask may look far more familiar than anyone ever imagined. As the investigation entered its most intense phase, the Long Island serial killer was no longer just a mystery. He became a presence that shaped decisions, influenced careers, and haunted the quiet moments of those on the case. Unresolved questions have a way of becoming personal, and for the investigators now leading the charge, this wasn't just about finding a name. It was about understanding how such calculated darkness could exist so seamlessly alongside ordinary life. This understanding became the foundation of our story's third act. The focus shifted from broad patterns to individual behaviors, from distant analysis to uncomfortable proximity. The closer investigators got, the more they realized the killer's greatest strength, his ability to blend in, was also his greatest vulnerability. Blending in requires constant effort, awareness, and restraint, and even the most disciplined mind eventually leaves traces behind. Advancements in technology played a crucial role. They weren't miracle solutions, but patient tools, allowing analysts to revisit old evidence with fresh eyes and connect information that once existed in isolation. As these data points slowly converged, a clearer image began to emerge. It wasn't a face, but a profile, refined enough to narrow the field significantly. This forced investigators to confront a difficult reality. The person they were searching for likely had education, stability, and professional credibility. He was someone used to navigating formal systems and using language as a shield. This realization was a psychological turning point. The killer wasn't some shadow lurking on the edges of society. He was moving confidently within its center. As pressure mounted, subtle changes began to appear. Not in public records, but in behavior, small deviations that happen when long-held control feels threatened. Profilers noted patterns of defensiveness, moments of overconfidence, and a growing need to assert intellectual superiority. These are traits that often surface when individuals feel their anonymity slipping. This paradox became a guiding principle for investigators. They reassessed suspects, focusing not just on who had the opportunity, but on who displayed the psychological need to dominate the narrative, even indirectly. The killer's lifestyle, once defined by a careful balance, started showing signs of strain. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but heightened caution, altered routines, and an increased reliance on control. This vigilance suggested he was aware the environment was changing, that the quiet certainty of being untouchable was no longer guaranteed. And fear, once introduced, alters decision-making. For someone who thrived on control, fear represented the ultimate threat, the one variable that could not be fully managed. Meanwhile, within law enforcement, momentum was building. This belief wasn't rooted in a single breakthrough, but in accumulation, the slow stacking of evidence, behavioral consistency, and analytical clarity. As these elements aligned, the investigation narrowed to focused scrutiny. Certain individuals began to stand out, not because of overt guilt, but because their stories required too much explanation, too much precision, too much effort to maintain. Investigators know that truth tends to be simple, while deception demands constant maintenance. The psychological duel between the killer and his pursuers intensified, unfolding in quiet offices and late-night strategy sessions. Both sides were waiting. Waiting had always been the killer's strength, but now that strength was being mirrored back at him. He was forced into a position he'd never truly occupied before, one where he was no longer dictating the pace, but reacting to it. This reversal introduced a new tension, where confidence and anxiety began to coexist uneasily inside his world. Publicly, the case remained cold. This apparent stagnation served as both frustration and camouflage, allowing investigators to work without interference while reinforcing the killer's assumption that silence meant safety. But beneath this silence, the final pieces were falling into place. The end of such a story rarely arrives with a dramatic confrontation, but with quiet inevitability, the moment when all paths converge and the truth becomes singular and undeniable. By this point, the mask has not yet fully fallen, but it is slipping, strained by time, scrutiny, and the simple fact that no constructed identity can withstand endless examination. The Long Island serial killer, though still unnamed in this moment, stands closer to exposure than ever before, his carefully curated invisibility eroding under the weight of accumulated attention. As the investigation prepares to cross the threshold from suspicion to certainty, one final realization emerges with unsettling clarity. The most dangerous illusion isn't believing that monsters are hidden, but believing they are rare. Sometimes they are simply patient, waiting for the moment when the world finally looks long enough to see them. As the investigation into the Long Island serial killer entered its final, critical phase, a decade of simmering tension began to transform. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a quiet, deliberate reckoning. Years of patience, meticulous observation, and unwavering persistence were finally starting to converge, their combined force ready to illuminate truths that had lurked in the shadows for far too long. Every moment of control the killer had maintained, every carefully measured step, every invisible maneuver, it wasn't just a series of random acts. It was a map of patterns, behaviors, and choices that, no matter how carefully concealed, could not remain hidden forever. And in this final stage, the balance of power began to shift. This shift wasn't marked by violence or some dramatic Hollywood-style confrontation. Instead, it was happening through the meticulous, almost silent, alignment of evidence, human insight, and raw intuition. As investigators began to piece together the mosaic of a life lived in secrecy, they started to understand the profound paradox of the killer's existence. Outwardly, he was ordinary. He was socially functional, held down a job, and was professionally competent. He was a neighbor, a colleague, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. Yet inwardly, his life was defined by a mastery of anonymity, a skill that had allowed him to operate undetected for so long. Recognizing this duality became the central key to resolving the entire narrative. In the public imagination, it wasn't just the horrific acts themselves that defined him. But this unsettling, chilling awareness that such calculated invisibility could coexist so seamlessly alongside total normalcy. The monster wasn't a creature from the shadows. He was hidden in plain sight. Throughout this period, as the net began to tighten, the killer's behavior started to show subtle cracks. These weren't grand, obvious mistakes. They were small, almost imperceptible deviations from his usual perfection. These cracks suggested the immense psychological weight of being observed, analyzed, and relentlessly pursued. While a casual onlooker would notice nothing, these tiny fissures gave investigators the leverage they desperately needed. They could now draw connections that were previously obscured, clarify patterns that had seemed random, and narrow their focus toward a resolution that relied as much on mental acuity and behavioral science as it did on hard evidence. Think about it. When a life has been so carefully, obsessively constructed around control, the very first sign of losing that control is often the key that unlocks everything. And in this case, that key didn't emerge from a single source. It was a powerful combination of modern forensic insight, sophisticated behavioral analysis, and the sheer, dogged persistence of those who are unwilling to let time obscure the truth. They prove that even the most disciplined and patient individuals leave behind traces, faint whispers of their presence that only require a careful eye and an even more patient mind to follow. As these final, crucial pieces of the puzzle began to align, the story of the Long Island serial killer revealed itself to be not one of sudden capture or a climactic, action-packed confrontation. It was a story of revelation. The hidden rhythms of a life so meticulously managed were finally being exposed, not by force, but by observation, analysis, and the quiet, unwavering persistence of those committed to understanding what had been overlooked for so long. And in this revelation, there was a strange kind of clarity that actually surpassed the fear. The resolution wasn't just about punishment or spectacle. It was about comprehension, a deep, unflinching understanding of how someone could move unseen within our ordinary society, and how that same ordinary society can, in turn, be both an unwitting observer and a participant in the unfolding of an extraordinary, hidden reality. In this closing chapter, the killer's life is perfectly framed by this duality, the constant tension between visibility and invisibility, between a facade of normalcy and an interior world of extraordinary calculation. And while his name and identity were, for a long time, a cipher in this narrative, the story itself conveys a truth that is far more compelling than just identification alone. It teaches us about the intricate interplay between silence and observation, between patience and vigilance. It shows how these forces create outcomes that ripple far beyond individual acts, influencing community perception, shaping investigative methods, and forever changing our collective understanding of human behavior. As the final lines of inquiry were drawn together, one lesson stood out with undeniable resonance, a moral that is both suspenseful and deeply reflective. It's this: the most profound mysteries are not resolved through force or fear. They are solved through sustained attention, careful reasoning, and the recognition that what is hidden in plain sight is often the most powerful presence of all. And in that recognition lies both the cautionary tale and the enduring intrigue of this case. The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe to join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.